Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Azim Khan. I'm a story scholar at the 1947 Partition Archive and a South Asian Studies lecturer. Welcome to the 75 Days of Partition series. This is day 69 of hosting esteemed guests for this series, which will continue till August 17th. Today, we will be speaking to Sumallya Mukhopadhyay. Let me start by giving you a brief bio. Shumallo is an MA in English Literature from Presidency University, Kolkata. At present, he is a doctoral candidate at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in the Indian Institute of Technology, New Delhi. His areas of interest includes, among other things, the politics of disposition and dispossession in narrative related to the 1947 partition of Bengal. He has presented papers at academic conferences in India and abroad. He has published his findings in journals like Studies in People's History, Journal of Migration Affairs, and Narrative Culture. He has been awarded the International Oral History Association Scholarship in 2020 and Tata Trust Partition Archive Research Grant 2021. At present, he is a South Asia Speaks Fellow working on a book of creative nonfiction based on the 1947 partition. Thank you for joining us, Shumalo. How are you?
Thank you. I'm fine. I'm fine. Thank you for such a generous introduction. And I must also congratulate the 1947 Partition Archive for curating this wonderful series of podcasts. I've been following it for the last few weeks to commemorate the 75th year of the partition. So it's indeed an honor to be here.
Thank you so much, and it's an honor and a pleasure to have you. I'll start by asking you the most obvious question: how did your interest in partition develop?
Uh, I would like to answer that. I have a PPT, if it can be displayed. Uh, yes. For this session, I have titled my presentation as Partition Refugees Art of Storytelling. Uh, so basically, I will be focusing on the tone and tenor, the mode and manner in which refugees share their life stories in the spatial configuration of the oralist interview. But before I go into all of that, I'd like to answer your question that what really piqued my interest in researching on partition and oral history for my PhD. Uh, so I'll start with this photo. It's a banner that was displayed by East Bengal fans in a match against Mohun Bagan in January 2020 in Calcutta. And the banner reads, Rokto diye kena mati, kagoj diye na. So it's in Bangla, and the rough English translation would be, got our land at the expense of our blood, not papers. Now, if we just go back to that particular period of time, I'm talking about January 2020 or December 2019, uh, the streets of India were divided because of a large-scale political mobilization in what came to be known as anti-NRC and anti-CA protest. And the banner that you're seeing here, depicted by these Bengal fans during a match, is obviously a political one. And such a culture was not prevalent in Kolkata football, for that matter, to make political statements like this on an issue that's almost dividing our society. But you understand that this political statement basically underscores the fact that the very act of having to produce our documents to prove our citizenship credentials is quite a disturbing aspect, especially for those who had been expropriated or dispossessed owing to the partition in 1947. And just to familiarize everyone with the context, in Bengal, in West Bengal, we have these two great institutions. On the one hand, we have Mohun Bagan, a club traditionally supported by those who are residents of the western parts of Bengal. In Bangla, we call them Khotis. And on the other hand, East Bengal, the club I was talking about. The name itself is suggestive of the white fan base of the club, people who trace their roots to the eastern parts of Bengal, more often than not, end up supporting East Bengal. So the banner that was displayed by the East Bengal fans here, it's making a very important statement, keeping in mind their fan base. And in a way, it brought back memories of what really initiated or inspired me to think about partition. Because I was a big fan of Kolkata football since I was 8 years old. And in those days, we did not have live telecast on matches. So I used to tune into the radio to listen to the commentary of matches between Mohun Bagan and East Bengal. And with the passage of time, I was drawn to this innocuous banter between these two sets of supporters, the Khotis and the Bangals. And gradually I realized that the cultural connotations of these banters, which focused on linguistic differences, which focused on distinct culinary cooking styles, had were not really restricted to the club. It had a larger ramification in the society, in the Bengal society at large. And in a way, that inspired me. In a way, you can say football inspired me to think of partition, because I wanted to see what exactly it meant to be, what exactly it meant for people to associate with this Bengal identity, what it meant to be a Bengal, which again corresponds to being a refugee or a Utbastu in West Bengal. And since I do not come from a partition family myself, all these factors did come into play. Though my mother's side of the family traced their roots to Dhaka, but their migration was not related to partition. They migrated in early 1940s. So one could say that all these factors, this distinction between Ghoti and Bangal, the two clubs that I was talking about, and my interest in football really inspired me to follow the narratives of those who had been dispossessed due to the uh, Radcliffe Line, which was drawn in 1947.
Wow, that is quite a story, and it shows us the power of sports. A lot of times, sports people are told to just shut up and dribble. That's the most famous thing. I mean, they said to LeBron James, right? Shut up and
Mm,
dribble.
mm, mm,
Politics and sport should be kept apart.
mm,
Just briefly, I'll give you. If you follow English football, I support Liverpool. I myself am a big football fan, and so in the
mm,
past year, three times Liverpool has played in a showpiece domestic cup final. So when God Save the Queen, the British national anthem comes on, the Liverpool
mm,
supporters boo the anthem
mm,
as an
mm,
anti-establishment and anti-conservative and anti a pro-republican
mm,
message. So the whole country is
mm,
up
mm,
in arms. They tell them to keep politics out of football. And again, I just think
mm,
it's so fascinating that sport has this, especially football, has this political
mm,
fabric to it.
mm.
Thank you so much for that. That's a that's a fascinating journey. Um,
Yes.
so you coming to your research, tell us more about it. Tell us more about what you're doing for your PhD candidacy.
Yes. So, like I said, this was basically my interest, which developed for the when I was in class 8, and it continued during my school life and college life. And when I came to my research, I decided to work on this particular topic. And the more I read literature, which were focused on the intersection of partition and oral history, I realized that oral historians or scholars who have worked on oral history and partition time and again ask this question: why remember? The underlying assumption being that the partition is a traumatic and a violent affair, and the very act of remembering is a difficult exercise for many. In my research, I have acknowledged this aspect. However, I have reformulated the above question, why remember, to ask instead, how does one remember? And as a student of literature, I was more interested in following uh, the movement, the movement beyond silence, I would say, beyond silence, beyond the stutters and stammers which were embedded in the narrative, to see how refugees, when given a chance, frame their narrative, design their narrative. And accordingly, I have in mind three narratives that I want to discuss. If we have the slides again. Uh, so the first narrative is that of Mr. Anil Kumar Kundu. You can see his name in the document that I'm projecting on the screen, and it was issued in the year 1949, as it says. So Anil Kumar Kundu was born on 1st May 1932, and he migrated in 1950, 3 years after the partition. He completed his schooling in East Pakistan. And the friend who introduced me to Anil Kumar Kundu told me that he suffered from occasional memory loss. And given his age, I mean, when I interviewed him, he was around 86 years old. So, given his age, it was evident that a person of that age would suffer occasional memory loss. So, when I went to his house to interview him, I sat down. He handed me a paper, just like that. He slid the paper across the table and said, "Read it aloud. You will find all the details there." So I took the paper and I started reading it, and it basically comprised his entire family tree, a description of his ancestral home in Faridpur, which is present day in Bangladesh, the route that his family had taken to come to West Bengal, and how they resettled and rehabilitated themselves in the new region. So what I did was I gave the paper back to him and I said, "Why don't you read it yourself, so that I get an idea of what you're planning to share with me during the interview?" And in the next few minutes, he took the paper and he started reading it in a very sophisticated manner. It was a kind of a performance for to be done in front of a particular audience, which the audience in this case is me. And I realized that he is trying to perform his stories, and this was a recurrent aspect in his narrative. Later, when we were talking about the religious and the caste composition of his village, he pointed out that he is a lower caste Hindu, and during a particular festival in his village, the Brahmins would come to their house but would not enter his house until and unless his mother would wash the feet of the Brahmin. The feet being washed, the Brahmin would then step into the house. And when he narrated that particular episode, I couldn't understand it. What exactly was he trying to say? And seeing my perplexed expression, he started performing the entire incident again. He just bent down, he showed me how the plate was placed right beneath the feet of the Brahmin and how his mother washed the Brahmin's feet. And it was interesting because I realized that this is something that he's doing it intentionally, so that he can convey the importance of these episodes in his life. He's trying to perform them for me, so that I get a sense of what he's trying to convey. And if you look at the document again, the reason I'm projecting this document is because when we were looking at the documents, he in particular, he had a couple of other documents. He in particular held this document in front of him and asked me to sit next to him. And where I went and sat next to him, and he pointed out, look how they have struck off Bengal to write Pakistan instead. I said, yes, I do see that. And he again remembered the entire episode of the official scratching that Bengal part off and pinpointing Pakistan there. And he smiled and said that that official merely thought that striking off Bengal and writing in East Pakistan would make me a citizen of East Pakistan. And he made the most poignant statement of the entire interview. He said, I'm neither a citizen of India, I'm neither a citizen of East Pakistan. I'm a citizen of undivided Bengal. I will always be one. And again, he performed it. He scribbled out that part. He showed me how the official did it. And when I came back home, I was listening to the interview. I realized that an oral history interview can be called as performance as well. I went on to argue that in my research that it is an oral history interview is a performative narration. It's basically a performative embodiment of one's stories. And this is something that I'm grateful to Anil Kumar Kundu, because largely the manner he narrated the story made me realize that oral history interviews can be read as performances, especially because they are being shared almost after 60, 70 years with in front of an interviewer who's mostly unknown to the narrator in that case. The second narrative, again, that I want to briefly talk about is that of Shunil Chandrapal. Uh, Now you see this document, it's a wonderful document because it's an appointment letter that was issued to Shunil Chandrapal in the year 1960 by the government of East Pakistan. He was appointed as a lecturer in Sanskrit in Rajshahi University. And he migrated in 1964, early 1964. So when I came to know about this during the interview, I was very interested to know what exactly were his experience. Because he had stayed in East Pakistan for almost 16, 17 years. And the literature, as a researcher, I read relevant literature on the partition, and the literature that I read suggested that Hindus in East Pakistan were treated as second-class citizens. So I wanted to know if he faced any kind of differential treatment, any kind of discrimination. And so I asked him a couple of questions. And what he did is that he did not answer my question directly. Instead, he referred to some anecdotes concerning his life in East Pakistan. In particularly, he mentioned one figure, Dr. Saidullah, one of his mentors. During a particular phase in life when there was a financial insecurity, instability in his family, it was Dr. Saidullah who urged him to take some money and continue his studies. Later, after completing his MA, it was again Dr. Saidullah who gave him a recommendation. And based on the recommendation, he got this job. And it is in this manner that he tried to convey to me that rather than facing differential treatment, he instead was on the receiving end of very sensitive feeling, for that matter, from people who do not belong to his same religion. And it was quite striking for me, because I realized that perhaps what is the literature saying, that Hindus were second class citizens, but Shonil Chandrapal did not really feel like a second class citizen. Otherwise, he would not have mentioned Dr. Saidullah and how he helped him in his study. And later again, when he was talking about his classroom experience, he particularly mentioned his Muslim students. He candidly confessed that he was quite young. It was his first classroom experience of being a classroom teacher. And it was his Muslim students who really made him feel comfortable. And he still, when he was carrying on with his narration, he said that I still remember them. I fondly recollect those memories, the initial memories, my first batch of students in Rajshahi. Unfortunately, the day he retired as a school teacher in West Bengal, he wanted some of the students to come. Unfortunately, they couldn't come. But he fondly remembered them. And anecdotes like this made me realize that oral history interview is not just about the question, direct question and answers, that I ask a question and I derive some information. Rather, one can call it an anecdotal exchange as well, because this is how narrators of the refugees tend to frame their stories. They tend to govern the direction of the narrative, the course of the narrative. And as students of literature, I have read relevant literature on uh, anecdotes, and anecdotes have a very, very powerful role to play, because anecdotes to a great extent tend to challenge our common perception regarding various incidents of historic significance. And in this case, it is the partition. And the anecdotes that Shonil Chandrapal shared with me made me realize that yes, we need little stories like this to bridge the differences, to reconcile the differences, and draw a common ground where perhaps we can move beyond animosity and fear and violence to talk about fellow feeling, brotherhood, and companionship. And the last narrative that I will talk about is that of Bhadru Bishwas. Yeah. So this is the certificate of registration of Bhadru Bishwas's family. Uh, it was issued in the year 1977, issued in the name of Bhadru Bishwas's father, Bonomali Bishwas. What is distinct in Bhadru Bishwas's narrative is that he had a very difficult life. Uh, Not only was he a lower caste Hindu, but unlike Anil Kumar Kundu, his family was not economically well off. So his family migrated in the wake of the 1965 Indo-Pakistan War from East Pakistan. And since they had no resources, they had to stay in a transit camp in Hasnabad, West Bengal. And after staying at the camp for a few weeks, the entire family was deported by the government agencies to Raipur, which is at present day Chhattisgarh in central India, where they were stationed in Mana camp. Their house was in Mana camp 21. And after staying in Mana camp for a few years, the family migrated again, this time voluntarily, and they came to Morichapi in Sundarban. And there, Bhadru Bishwas decided he would get married. It's time to get married. And largely owing to his marriage to Reena, his family could secure a plot of land near Domdom, which is in Kolkata. So this was his entire story. And I time and again asked my narrators, that, do you have any document? Do you remember seeing any document? Your family preserving any document? And Bhadru Bishwas was quick to dismiss the question. He was like, I had no time to look at documents. I don't remember seeing any documents. I had to make both ends meet. I had to bring food to the table for my family. And his wife was there during the interview. She interjected. She's like, no, 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 no. I think you have either forgotten or you're mistaken somewhere. There is a document. So I looked at Reena and I said, can you show me the document? She said, yes, of course, I can show you the document. And she took out the file and showed me this document and said that her father-in-law, Bonomali Bishwas, gave it to Reena and said that preserve this document because this document proves we are citizens of India. If anyone challenges them, questions their citizenship credential, then Reena is supposed to show them this document. And I found it interesting because this is not Reena's story to tell. This is this is a document. Of course, Rina married to the family, but this is a story that belongs to Father Vishwas. Rina had a different story. Rina's family migrated as well from East Pakistan. Her mother was categorized as a permanent liability, stayed in a permanent liability, did not stay, received vocational training in a permanent liability camp in Pasperia. That's her story to tell. But to identify with this story, which belonged to Bhadrav Vishwas's family, I found it very, very interesting. And I asked her, did you tell these stories to anyone else in the family? Because obviously Bhadrav Vishwas either does not remember or has forgotten it. So he looked at her daughter, who was standing at the door, and said, she remembers, she knows some of it. So I looked at the daughter and I said, do you know the stories of this document and how your grandfather gave it to your mother? She said, yes, I do know the stories. And later, when I came back home again, in retrospect, I understood that this is how people, refugee families, remember their stories. You can call it intergenerational recollection, but this is how they remember, this is how they recollect, and this is how they rehearse their experiences during the oral history interview. And it gets the stories get passed from one generation to another. In a way, it get those stories get percolated from one generation to another, and somehow it attests to the historicity of the story, and also give the story an afterlife. So in fine, this is how I have recorded, analyzed, read, and I've tried to preserve the stories of people who decided to share their experiences with me.
Yeah, that was brilliant. I would just like to comment on like two dichotomies that you highlighted and which I have seen in my association with the Partition Archive as well. Firstly, the second example you brought up, the dichotomy between state narratives or state documentation and personal narratives. For example, like you said, the government might have discriminated with Hindus at an official level, at an institutional level, but that was not necessarily the case between people and societies and just at an interpersonal level. And I've come across this through so many of the interviews I've seen and I've conducted with the archive. And secondly, the first instance you mentioned of oral history and the difference between oral history and its use as a narration, as a performance, compared to documentation, which is like cold hard documentation. And one of my it was a very interesting story someone told me that they were in but the Bastis of Jalandhar, and so at that time it was less of a capitalistic private property owning kind of arrangement. So this person owned a lot of property in the Bastis, and he would just rent out the space in bazaar to Hindus and Sikhs for like almost negligible amount of money. So the rent was very low, but he just kept it so that they would come, they would conduct commerce in the area, in the bastis. So when partition happened and the government was allotting property back to him that they had lost, they looked at the details, they looked at the documents, and they said the rent was only this amount, this small amount. Hence, he owned this amount of property, which again was smaller than the actual property that he owned. So he got, in return, he got much less than he actually would have if he had higher rent. So, like you showed with your example, it's the reality of the documentation is not the reality of the lived experience of the people who were there. The documents we get tend to get bogged down in the study of history has tended to, in the past at least, got bogged down in these in taking documents as cold hard facts, and oral history as just stories and performances which do not have a lot to do with facts or truth. And I think the way you explained it was so beautifully um, illustrated how oral history can actually be more, sometimes, not all the time, but can actually sometimes be more closer to the truth. As if I'm reading a book, I won't necessarily get the gravity of the situation that I might get when the person is narrating his anecdote, like you said, himself. And I thought that was so beautifully explained. Thank you for that.
I think that's what oral historians do. I mean, they look for stories like this, little stories, little snippets of conversation, because those small details matter the most when you look at the grand scheme of things. Make you realize that there are fractures, and you need to look beyond this grand narrative. Look at the fractures to see how you can destabilize the grand nationalistic narratives to move beyond a space, which is to some extent will allow us to reconcile our differences. Because there's no denying it's an ugly past, but there has to be a tendency. It has been 75 years, and there has to be encouragement from the people themselves to move beyond the ugly past, to look at some sort of reconciliation, if possible. Yeah, and I think oral history can do that because the experience is mostly similar on either sides of the border, be it Bengal, be it Punjab, be it East Pakistan or Bangladesh and West Bengal or Pakistan or India for that matter. The experiences are more or less similar.
Yes, definitely. And I think a lot of these interviews, not just the interviews that we at the archive are doing, but interviews that you generally see on YouTube or social media platforms or Facebook, these interviews actually tend to have much more of an impact worldwide in the South Asian diaspora than just merely a book or a national narrative would. And I think like one of the people I interviewed, he got messages from all over the world, from people in India, from Hindus, from Sikhs, from everyone. Just like, oh, you look just like my grandfather. You remind me of my father. It's like it brings us closer. Then, because like you said, we can see people's emotions, we can see people's humanity that we might not otherwise see in like a book or in just written narratives. So moving on, I mentioned in your bio you had a grant and you had a grant with the archive. Will you please tell us about your work there?
Uh, I think I got the grant last year in May, and first of all, it was extremely beneficial for my research because oral history is a very personal exercise. You have to go to people's home, interview them in close proximity, and the pandemic was such that we barely met other people, and so my research was cut short. Uh, so and I had to look for other avenues to look at narratives, and I got the grant thankfully, and the wonderful repository that the 1947 Partition Archive has had really helped me in a sense not only get added material related to my research, but also regarding the theoretical arguments that I'm trying to think through oral history. Because oral history we generally think of between two individuals, the narrator or the interviewee, and the interviewer. So, but in the narratives that I listened to, I could see that in most cases, the interviewer is not the researcher because the researcher is me. I have not interviewed these people, and it adds a different dimension. What happens when oral history narratives like these go public? How will people react to it? What inferences they will draw, and what ethical role, one would say, the researcher has to play in it. Because in most cases, the researcher is not the interviewer, so he or she cannot possibly interject and put forward a different question for that matter, or try to bring to light a different point before the interviewee. So it was very very interesting for me, and in a way it has got me thinking about how it is possible uh, for a researcher who is not the interviewer
We're just having some technical issues. We'll be back.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
go on.
was it from my end? Yeah, was it from my end? Sorry.
Yeah, I think so. It's okay.
Yeah.
Let's go. Let's move on.
Yeah, so basically that was the grant about, and like I said, it's a wonderful collection that the Partition Archive has done. I mean, I got to know about narratives related to Anglo-Indians, Parsis, and I read about these people in various novels, uh, on short stories, but to see live interviews of those individuals who, one would say, were not directly affected by the partition, but of course they were emotionally, they were involved by the entire topsy turvy that was happening all around, and it was quite an enriching experience for me. because, like I said, I got to listen to a uh, large scale volume of narratives, and really did help my research to a good extent.
Yeah, in one of my interviews, I never knew. So apparently, one of my interviews told me that in the 50s and 60s, Chinese shoemakers in Pakistan were the best shoemakers, and there were a lot of Chinese shoemakers, and I never had any idea.
Mm,
We never read it in a book, and no
mm,
Pakistani history book had ever even intimated that there was something like this. So I think, like you said, you get to know so much about society and culture, which I mean, books just can't. And especially like state narratives and institutional
mm, mm,
histories, they
mm,
just don't go into the minutiae of
mm,
cultural life and societal life.
mm. I agree. Yes, that's the beauty of working on oral narratives, I would say. It's versatile, it's diverse, and most importantly, it opens up new avenues for one to understand history.
Definitely, definitely. Thank you so much for that wonderful, for that extremely passionate narration that you gave us. And I just feel right now like I should go out and conduct an interview because the way you explained it, I literally want to go right now. Um,
Yes.
thank,
Yeah, thank you for having me here.
thank you so
Thank you.
much for that wonderful, and thank you all for joining us. Please tune in next week for another amazing conversation with the 1947 Partition Archive is hosting the series to commemorate 75 years of partition. This series is a daily micro podcast series being aired for 75 days between June 3rd and August 17th, except for Sundays, to commemorate the 75th anniversary of partition in 2022. For context, August 17th is the day the Boundary Commission announced the Radcliffe Line separating India and Pakistan, 75 days after the partition plan was announced on June 3rd, 1947. Thank you so much once again, and please show us your love and support by sending the hearts and like emojis under this video. For any query, DM us on social media or connect with any of our team members.